NEXTOR was established in 1996 as an FAA Center of Excellence in Aviation Operations Research. It initially included 4 core universities, but over time expanded. In 2011, it transitions to NEXTOR 2, an FAA consortium in aviation operations research that included 8 universities: Georgia Tech, George Mason University, MIT, Ohio State, Purdue, UC Berkeley, University of Maryland, and Virginia Tech. It recently was renewed once more, becoming NEXTOR 3. We are pleased to bring together academic researchers with industry and government leaders to examine the impact of COVID-19 on air transportation. We are examining the crisis through several lenses. The first 2 webinars considering the airline and airport perspective. This webinar, again, looks at the crisis from the airline point of view.
We have with us 2 distinguished speakers today, Dr. Peter Belobaba, Principal Research Scientist at MIT and Co-Director of MIT's Global Airline Industry Program, and Bill Swelbar, Chief Analyst at the Swelbar Consultancy and Research Engineer at MIT. We also have a panel of academic researchers from the NEXTOR University Consortium. In addition to Professor Ball, we are joined by J.P. Clark, College of Engineering Dean's Professor at Georgia Tech. J.P. holds appointments in aerospace engineering and industrial and systems engineering. He's also director of the Air Transportation Laboratory at Georgia Tech. And Lance Sherry, Associate Professor of Systems Engineering and Operations Research and Director of the Center for Air Transportation Systems Research at George Mason University.
We will begin with talks by each of our 2 invited guests. After each talk, we will take a few questions. Then, after all speakers have concluded, we will have a panel discussion.
I will moderate the panel. The academics will be able to ask questions directly of our speakers. You in the audience will be able to ask questions via the Zoom Q&A feature. Our apologies in advance if we are unable to address all your questions. As before, we will conduct a series of audience polls during the webinar using the Zoom polling feature. As you will see, the questions deal with your perceptions of the risk of flying right now and your likelihood to fly in the future. The results will be presented right after the polling. With that, let's get to our first poll. All right. Do you feel that after the pandemic, business air travel will return to its prior levels, or will a new normal with less business air travel evolve? So the possibilities are business air travel will eventually return to where it was pre-pandemic. There will be a modest long-term reduction in business air travel. There will be substantial long-term reduction in business air travel. So please go ahead and answer these questions, or pick one of the 3 choices.
I guess the host and panelists have been disenfranchised.
Yeah.
You're going to tell us what you think.
Okay.
Kat, I can't see the results, so I guess you'll, oh, here we go. Okay. All right, so as you can see, the biggest vote getter was the middle one, which is somewhat significant in that means you think there will be some long-term impact, at least a modest one, and then there's slightly more people think that it will return to where it was than think it'll even be a more major impact. Okay, with that, let's move forward to our first presentation by Peter Belobaba of MIT.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And we've got 3 talks today. One, I'm going to do the first one, and as noted here, it's an introduction on the impacts of the pandemic on the global airline industry. This is meant to be a sort of more of a global overview. My colleague, Bill Swelbar, will come in after I'm finished on this and give a more detailed look at the US airline industry and some of the more recent developments there. And then we'll wrap it up with a third presentation on our projections for the prospects for recovery. So even before we start, before I get into the details of what's been happening globally with respect to, or since the pandemic has started, let's go back to where we came from. I think some of the, several slides on recent history really help put this recent pandemic impact into perspective. Both typically we have seen, as you see here, average annual growth in passenger traffic, passenger kilometers of 5 to 6% per year. And that's been closely tied to a rough 2 to 3% annual growth, in economic growth in GDP. And, and basically I point this out because that growth has been quite steady. You see here that US airlines have grown, but airlines in other parts of the world have typically and consistently grown at much faster rates. But 5 to 6% has been the average, with the exceptions of post 9/11 in 2001 and post the recession and financial crisis in 2008 and 9. And in those years, we saw about less so worldwide, but in the US, we saw about a 5% drop in passenger traffic. And I raise that, and you should remember that number, 5%, because we'll have to compare that to what's about to happen for 2020. This is a slide I put in just recently, just a review of who are the largest players, major players in the global industry. The major points I want to make here is that the big three US carriers, American, United, and Delta, are still numbers 1, 2, and 3. Here you see the top 25 from 2019. Again, this is where we came from at the end of last year. Southwest, Alaska, JetBlue are still making the top 25 list. I highlight here in green what I call emerging global airlines. And I call them that because basically 15 years ago, if I showed you this same chart, none of these airlines would have been on the top 25 list. And Emirates now is the 4th biggest carrier of passenger traffic. And just in the past year, the 3 largest Chinese carriers, China Southern, Air China, China Eastern, have all leapt ahead of Southwest to become numbers 5, 6, and 7. And again, this just shows you that the growth, outside the U.S. has been occurring at a much faster clip than it has been among U.S. airlines. We've had a very successful decade. This is the first time in history, or at least I look back all the way to 1945, but the first time in history that the global airline industry was able to post 10 consecutive years of profitability through 2019. As you see here, we've had a very good global commercial airline profitability. Oops, there we go. And in the US as well, you see here that much of the global profit has been driven by US and North American carriers. It's a very cyclical business, but again, we've had a very unprecedented 10-year run of operating and net profits. And that's where we came from. Last year was pretty good for the US airlines. All of the largest US airlines shown here in 2019 posted profit margins in the average 8 to 10% range. That doesn't sound like a big number for other industries like petroleum and telecommunications and software, but certainly for the airline business, these were very, very good times. And that's why it's all the more disheartening that we went from global record global profits to a global pandemic, right? We've came at the end of 2019, as I said, 10 consecutive years of global profit. North American and US carriers in particular actually had become far and away the most profitable in the world. I don't think many US passengers realize that the US carriers are the most efficient, most productive, and most profitable airlines in the world, and we were in a very good position there. The legacy carriers in Europe had made improvements, but still weren't very cost competitive with either our US legacy carriers or with emerging carriers from the Middle East, China, as well as the so-called low-cost carriers. One thing that we also were observing prior to the pandemic was the phenomenal growth of Middle East carriers like Emirates, Etihad, Qatar had already been slowing, right? Even in 2018 and 17 and 18, their growth of traffic growth was slowing, their load factors are going down, and they were already encountering financial troubles. But nonetheless, the industry overall was in a very good position until we get down to this year, where COVID-19 effectively decimated the airlines' performance, decimated their schedules, and certainly will continue to decimate their financial performance. We have an economic recession. We have passenger concerns about flying. We have border restrictions on international travel that have now led initially rather to an unimaginable 90% demand decrease. Forget about 5%. We saw a 90% drop. We had in March and April, we saw some early signs of traffic recovery in May and June, but that was quickly extinguished by a return of higher COVID rates. And I think what you'll hear over the next 40 minutes is that it's not clear when or even if demand and the industry will return to normal. And another question is, what will that normal be? How will it be different? This is what I was referring to just from IATA, the industry revenue passenger kilometers, meaning just passenger traffic carried multiplied by the distance flown. Never before have we seen global airline passenger traffic drop in the course of what effectively was 2 months by over 90%. The data has been updated here. We've had some rebound, but it still is well below any kind of return to, even coming close to returning to where we were in terms of traffic. What I wanted to do is take a look at different parts of the world and what the impact has been in terms of scheduled passenger capacity. And so you'll see that there are many similarities between the slides I'm going to show here that are upcoming for different regions, but also some important differences. One of the important differences is, I mentioned the largest Chinese airlines, Air China, China Southern, China Eastern. They are now, as I said, number 5, 6, and 7 at the end of 2019 in terms of passenger traffic ranking. They have actually rebounded. They've rebounded the most quickly, driven by strict controls on COVID within the country, and also mostly driven by a strong capacity recovery in a very large Chinese domestic air travel market. They're not back to normal yet, but this is far and away the strongest recovery that we're seeing in any part of the world. If you contrast that with other Asian carriers that are not those big Chinese airlines with a strong domestic market, Cathay Pacific, Korean, All Nippon, and Singapore, you see that there has been effectively no recovery. The total capacity they're offering, not to mention their traffic, which is even lower, but the total scheduled capacity has remained flat at about 25% of February levels. And if you're Cathay Pacific, or in particular Singapore Airlines with no domestic market, you are entirely at the mercy of the international border closures and travel restrictions. Looking at the Middle East carriers, they also have seen little to no or minimal recovery. Now you think about it, Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar, and I include Turkish here, but think about Emirates in particular, zero domestic market. They are entirely dependent on Sixth Freedom international connecting traffic for their operation. And you see that Emirates and the others by April effectively had grounded their operations. They're struggling to come back a little to rebuild their traffic, but still they're below 20% or 25% of where they were before the pandemic. So not much evidence of recovery there. Over in Europe, among the network legacy carriers there was, again, you see here an initial rebound. Europe really locked down in April, May, and June. There was some hope that coronavirus rates had leveled off, and you see that carriers like Air France, KLM, Lufthansa started picking up their capacity, but again, have leveled off tremendously as you went into the fall, as the virus resurgence in Europe flattened the capacity growth curves. The LCC markets, the Ryanairs, the EasyJets, a little different story. They clearly were affected significantly. They dropped tremendously. They hoped for a big rebound of leisure traffic in June and July, and again have pulled back tremendously on that. The only exception being ultra low cost carrier Wizz Air seems to be able to is keeping its leisure markets flying. In the US, similar pattern to what we saw in Europe, although there was quite a bit of optimism early on, as you see here by Southwest and American, notably right after May and June. They, for a variety of reasons, put capacity back into the domestic. There's a domestic capacity here, put domestic capacity back in. United was significantly more conservative in doing so, but again, even they have had to pull back as in the US as the coronavirus rates have now reached record levels. And the international networks of our largest US airlines were basically wiped out in April and May. There is some effort here by the big three to build back some international capacity, but this capacity growth is unmatched by any kind of rebound in demand, mostly because you can't fly anywhere without going into quarantine or are meeting various border restrictions on which citizens can go into what countries. And so for the US airlines, we've got a situation. This is a Form 41 data through second quarter of this year. Basically revenues in the second quarter dropped by 90%. Here you see operating revenues and passenger revenues. Expenses decreased by only 50%. It's very difficult to ramp down an operation that quickly. There's a lot of fixed expenses, including labor and fleet, that the airlines have to keep paying. And therefore, we're in a situation now is through the first 3 quarters of 2020, the US airlines have posted well over $30 billion in operating losses. All the airlines here have suffered this as an absolute term, so it's not profit margins, but Delta has written off many of its labor costs and furlough costs and fleet retirements, so that they appear to have somewhat bigger operating losses than the others. But it's not a good scene in the US, nor is it a good scene financially for the global forecast. This is IATA's last forecast was in June for a negative $84 billion net loss in 2020, with a recovery, so to speak, to only $15 billion of net loss in 2021. That $84 billion, I think, was based in June, based on some optimism. That's going to be much worse by the time we add up the damage at the end of this year. We did have, we'll have some polls here today, and I think travel behavior is still one of the fundamental questions, not just about the timing. Everybody focuses on the timing of the return. I also think we need to focus about the volume of demand return. And that's what that first poll question got at, is if business travel returns, will it be at its full level? And so in this most recent survey, when would you be confident to take your next flight? Within 6 months, within a year, more than a year. And some are contingent on a vaccine until COVID-19 disappears. You can see the numbers there. How are your travel habits likely to change post-COVID-19? And this is where the big changes could well happen. Travel less frequently by air, travel to less faraway destinations, travel by air only if I have to, fly with only with specific airlines I trust. These are questions that will affect the prospects for recovery. We're really in uncharted territory, and I would put up the questions that we'll again have time to discuss later on. When and how will demand return? Everybody's very optimistic about the recent vaccine success announcements. Distribution is the bigger question, right? When will it be widely available? When will the virus subside to make passengers comfortable to fly? can airlines convince passengers that masks, cleaning protocols, social distancing are safe enough in the meantime? That doesn't appear to be the case thus far. What will be the depth and duration of this economic recession? Bill will talk about this more, but even if we do have a vaccine and people are willing to fly, I think a lot of folks are underestimating the impacts of the economic recession, impacts on disposable income and consumer confidence. And to the point that we looked at in the poll, to what extent will business travel return? And really the answer to these questions, we don't know them. We'll spend some time talking about them. They will shape the size and the characteristics of the future airline industry. I think between Bill and me here, we have little doubt it will be much smaller than what we saw in that very nice 2019 peak, but how long will it remain smaller? I believe, I don't know if Bill agrees, that it's almost inevitable that not all airlines will survive. We'll see more bankruptcies and mergers, and I'm right already. We've seen quite a few bankruptcies and an announced merger between Asiana and Korean Air just earlier last week. And the policy question is how much can, should, and will governments support airlines to prevent further liquidations and further job losses? And so that's my rather bleak overview of introduction and overview of what has gotten us here. I can stop sharing my screen. See if there are any immediate questions before we go on to Bill.
So please use the Q&A feature or the chat feature if you ask a question. I don't see one yet, so maybe I'll ask a question, Peter. So, the airlines cut a lot of costs, and I've heard, some people say, well, they're resizing. Well, they've gotten rid of fleets they probably wanted to get rid of anyway, so there's some positivity, but I wonder if there's some negative aspects. So for example, I know Delta had an inducement for a lot of people to, take up, voluntarily leave the company. And as, for example, is there a hollowing out maybe of some of the expertise in some of these airlines, or are there other negative effects of all this cost cutting?
Well, there's all kinds of negative effects, right? I mean, anytime you have layoffs or furloughs, it's almost inevitable that you end up losing, sort of counterintuitively, some of your best people who find other industries or other opportunities. So it's not clear that you're actually getting rid of the so-called deadwood. On the fleet side, I mean, I think just to keep it short, going back to our prediction that the airlines will be smaller, if any, given that take Delta for an example, with a smaller fleet, fewer employees, it's going to, by definition, have fewer ASMs. And one of the basic economics of airlines is that when you decrease your output, you're not able to decrease your costs by that amount. And so almost inevitably, it will mean higher unit costs for the smaller airlines.
Peter, we have a question about air cargo. Do you want to say anything about that, or will Bill cover that?
I don't know. Bill can jump in later on as well. I mean, I did not take a close look at air cargo. Air cargo has been one positive impact here, in that, as I don't know if you do know, but many airlines, Bill was talking about wide body aircraft, have taken their wide body aircraft and either grounded them or at least are flying them internationally solely for the purpose of carrying cargo. So when you go to the data from IATA, the cargo impacts have not been nearly as dramatic as they have been on the passenger side. So that's been but on the other hand, cargo doesn't pay the bills, right? It can't possibly overcome the loss, 90% loss of passenger traffic.
All right, thanks. I guess we probably should continue moving along. So let's hand it over to Bill.
Right. Well, first we do another poll.
Yes, another poll, Mike. Thank you.
Can we have the second poll? Okay, how long do you think it will take for US, and this is exactly what Peter was talking about. Let's see what your opinion is. How long do you think it will take for US airline domestic and international demand to return to pre-pandemic levels? 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years or more? Okay, so majority says 2 years or more. So maybe I should have said 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, but
Right.
there's not a lot of optimistic people in this group. But yeah, I think yeah, it's just a lot of what Peter has said. There's a lot of reasons why that's probably you know, the opinion of people and probably the most realistic.
Well, when we started the lockdowns, and I think everybody thought it would be a shorter time period before we return to normal.
Yeah, yeah.
As the months wear on, yeah, the projections have become much less sanguine.
Yep. Okay, so let's turn it over to Bill. He has actually 2 talks, but we're going to go through both of these and then we'll have questions afterwards and then move on to the panel. So go ahead, Bill.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Swelbar, and I am going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a lot about U.S. airline network strategies and their impacts on airports. And it sounds like you have been talking about that quite a bit. And you know, I think it's really important that as we talk about the airline industry and the fact that it likely gets smaller, it is definitely going to have impact on the nation's infrastructure. And so this deck, we kind of designed with airports in mind as much as airlines. So it has a use going both ways. My bad. Okay. So as we think about the changing network architecture, we go back and think about where we were at the end of the Great Recession. The carrier capacity deployment strategies were very, very important. And that was between 2010 and 2014, we were engaged, the industry engaged in a capacity discipline strategy, which was simply that if that they would grow capacity at a rate much less than that of the growth in the economy. And Peter talked about the strong relationship of the growth in capacity and the growth and relative to the economy in his talk in just a moment ago. You know, even though, you know, during that time, I mean, if a flight penciled out to be profitable, it wasn't flown, as there was likely a more profitable flight somewhere else on the network. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. You know, as a recovery begins, whatever it is that we can begin to call a recovery, and I think it's hard to call anything a recovery till we are on the right side of the curve, and we're clearly not there. You know, carrier capacity strategies are going to be very important going forward, especially as we do enter a recovery period. In our work here, we take a look, the numbers are going to reflect both in plane traffic and deplane traffic. And we do that because we really want to demonstrate the impact on airport throughput. And, you know, those are the people that buy concessions and newspapers and beer and all of those things. And that has a dramatic effect on the economics of the airport industry, to be sure. And we, as long as we're talking about the domestic side of the business, we also bake in the international component. And what we don't appreciate, I think, all the time is that 15% of the domestic network today is comprised of passengers that are continuing on to a domestic or an international journey. It's a significant amount of traffic, and that too is going to weigh on any recovery that we begin to see in the domestic side of the business. The data that you will see is actual data from January to July, and it's estimated based on our work between August and December. So where are the airlines focused today and where are they not? This chart represents, and how we went about this through much discussion was, so many believe that 2019 is the comparison period. When are we going to return to 2019 levels of demand? Well, a lot of that has to do with how it is that, networks are being deployed today. And as networks are deployed, how much of that 2019 traffic can be accommodated with the network that they're flying today. So what this chart shows is percent of 2019 domestic traffic not accommodated by most recent carrier schedules. And of course, you would expect to see that American, Delta, and United are not accommodating. They would be accommodating the least amount of their 2019 network, as they've been very slow to put capacity back into the system, as has Alaska. But you take a look at a Southwest, and while it is that it's only deployed, say, 3/4 of its aircraft, it's accommodating a little more than 25, only 28% of its 2019 traffic carried is not being accommodated by today's schedule. Everybody wants to refer to Southwest as a point-to-point carrier. What this number says very clearly to me is that Southwest is building connectivity across their network. So they are accommodating more traffic with less flying today than they did in 2019. Now, you might be surprised to see JetBlue. I think JetBlue, though, is very much a network in transition. JetBlue left Long Beach. They want to start an operation at LAX. There's only so much they can do at JFK. They're building an operation at Newark. So JetBlue is very clearly rethinking what its network is going to be on the other side of this. And it's also very important to appreciate how important the Northeast United States, Boston and New York and Washington, are to JetBlue and the transcon flying to the California corridor. When we think about traffic pools that are really not online today and still struggling, the Northeast United States and California is very slow to show any sign of recovery. And then we see Allegiant, and Allegiant being that unique carrier, we would expect them to be accommodating most of 2019. They're only flying schedules of 1 to 3 days a week. And so therefore they're able to offer those schedules and not lose as much money. So we did this for each of the carriers. We're not going to get into all of the detail, but really wanted to take a look at what are each of the carriers doing? Where are they focused today? Where are they not? And if we look at the American network, they've been very quick to build back their Dallas and Charlotte hubs. They have been, and they actually built back Miami fairly quick in the March, April, and May period. But a lot of that had to do with flows to South America and the like. They have been very slow to build back Chicago. They have been very slow to build back New York and LaGuardia. And so again, it's that, and LAX. So it's very much American DCA, LaGuardia, LAX being very important. They really haven't focused much on building back capacity. If you remember back in the summer period, American was quite excited about the possibility of a lot of peak flying to leisure destinations. And in July, we saw them add a significant amount of capacity. But since then, it has moderated and they have been very conservative in their capacity deployment. these charts clearly demonstrate, just demonstrate where American is focused. And again, if you look at the left, DFW and CLT, Dallas and Charlotte, they've been very focused there. You take a look at Miami, they have built back, again, a leisure-oriented destination. And then if you look in the kind of the middle, you see PHX or Phoenix, and they've been building that back. And I think simply a leisure destination, and we're moving into the peak period in Arizona. DCA, LAX, LGA, JFK, less than a third of what they were a year ago. Delta, very, very quietly has been building back its domestic network. It seems that they're being very conservative with the middle seat and the like, but they've been just kind of plodding along and building back their network. Most interesting is when we think about Delta, we think about Atlanta. Atlanta has been a little slower to come back than you might think, or I might think when we first did the analysis. But throughout this pandemic, Delta has been very focused on its Western hubs at Salt Lake City and Seattle. And I think it's very clear that those are points where it is you can access the wide open spaces and the national parks. Whereas the other network carriers have been slow to build back LAX, Delta has been building it back fairly quickly. If we look at Delta's domestic seat capacity versus a year ago, you can see it's a very steady climb, just kind of plodding through rebuilding their network a hub at a time, with Minneapolis and Detroit being the latest where they've done some focus in adding back capacity. But what's very interesting about Delta and what this chart says is that Detroit, or let's look at Atlanta, ATL, domestic regional departures in November 2020 versus last year are 103%. So if you look at Salt Lake City, 111%, Seattle, 105%, LAX, virtually 100%, they are doing a lot of building back of their domestic network with their regional partners. And that is unique when compared to American and United. We look at Delta's hubs. Atlanta is still less than 3/4 of its size in 2019. Salt Lake City is bigger than it was in 2019, and you can see its focus, its aggressive build back of its operation in Seattle and beginning to build back LAX, and just like American, very slow to build back LGA, LaGuardia, JFK, New York JFK, and Boston. Looking at United, they have been very, very conservative in adding back domestic capacity. They've been focused on their interior hubs of Denver, probably less so at Chicago, and Houston. But Denver has been a hub that the industry has kept its capacity in and has done very well relative to many other markets out there. If we look at United in June, it was operating less than 20% of its domestic seats than in 2019. Very slow growth back. But if we think about just how important the international piece is to United and how many domestic seats it fills, the international being non-existent is heavily influencing the build back of the United network. And if we look at the United hubs, you can see that all of them are less than 60% of what they were a year ago, except for Denver, which is nearly 3/4 the size of what it was a year ago. Southwest is the carrier to watch for all of us. They are the bellwether. They have an enviable balance sheet. They have a lot of cash. And they are going to be very, very aggressive at the expense of others, in my view. I I believe they will begin to demonstrate that in February, March, and April. But Southwest is back to flying nearly 80% of its 2019 capacity. As I mentioned, they've actually, this point-to-point carrier has been building back with a lot of connectivity. Focused again, Denver, Nashville, those are important points, and Vegas is slowly coming back online. This takes a look at what Southwest has been doing between June and November. They were very, very bullish in the summer. They saw bookings cool off, and they pulled a lot of capacity out of the system in September and October. And then in November, they've added back capacity. And it's my understanding with the level of demand around Thanksgiving, they're adding back even more capacity than that was scheduled. If we look at Southwest system, I'm not going to get into this in any great detail, but the important takeaway is really the fact that that bright blue line at the right of each of its focus cities, it's very, very consistent. They've really built back everything almost at the same level. Again, like I say, it's connectivity that is leveraging. That is leveraging the focus cities on its network and its traffic generation. JetBlue, work in progress, really tough for JetBlue to do anything without JFK in Boston, as we mentioned. If you look at JetBlue, it is still its outbound seat capacity, domestic outbound seat capacity in November is still less than 50% of what it was a year ago. And again, if you can't, for them, if there is no San Francisco, there is no Los Angeles, there is no Boston, there is no Washington, and there is no New York, it's hard for JetBlue to build out much of their system. If you take a look at what they're doing, though, as I mentioned, you're seeing them focus on LAX and Newark. And that's where it is that they've switched capacity from other airports and are building a presence. And if we think about LAX, they wanted out of Long Beach. It was very hard for carriers. There was no room at the LAX in 2019. And now as a result of some open gates and available gates, you see JetBlue being very aggressive in moving into that airport in the LA basin. And then in Newark, they seem to be doubling down in a United hub to build the scale and scope of its New York presence. Spirit, I only include Spirit because, we think of them as one of the important ultra low cost carriers, and they are. If we take a look at Spirit, they too were very bullish in the summer, saw bookings cool, pulled back dramatically, have started to build back capacity, and at least what they say today is they will continue to be fairly aggressive as we move forward. Allegiant, again, we expect them. You can see they really haven't pulled down much, but remember, again, this is a carrier that really operates schedules 1 to 3 days a week in any one market. And so they have maintained that service throughout the period studied here. So if we think about the expected airline impacts, the big three network carriers, American, Delta, and United, are going to cede market share to these 7 other carriers. And they're going to cede market share in a fairly significant way, I think, to Southwest. The fact that Southwest has announced 10 new points on its system, doubling down in Houston by adding service at Houston Intercontinental, doubling down in Chicago by adding service at Chicago O'Hare. I believe they have a bigger picture here. And the picture is business traffic after all this is over. And they need to position themselves in the large metro areas at the critical airport where there was not available infrastructure and build a presence today. So again, I encourage all of us to watch Southwest. They're very interesting and certainly setting the pace. as the airlines morph, what about the impact on airports? You know, in the previous two recessions, the network carriers recovered more slowly. It was the low cost and the ultra low cost carriers that grabbed share at their expense. The loss of connectivity here is going to impact the smallest airports again for the network carriers. But those numbers aren't really reflected yet. We'll show you some in just a minute. The smallest markets have done okay, but a lot of that had to do with the fact that the network carriers were required to maintain service in those small markets when they took the grant under the CARES Act in April of this year. And so if we think about the growth in the airports between 2015 and 2019, it is not foreseen that all that capacity will return to the medium and small hubs. You know, Peter showed some charts that looked at 10 years of profitability, but the last 3 years profitability had been in decline, and some of that capacity, I think, was simply uneconomic and will not likely be added back post-COVID. If we think about, you know, the regions of the country where capacity has come back and added back the most, in the mountain region, 84% of 2019 seats are being flown today. That is the region with the most seats. And as I mentioned, you know, this is all about wide open spaces and mountains and you know, people from California just kind of tired of California and moving to Idaho. As I joked with somebody, I mean, before we know it, we're going to have nonstop service between Boise and Honolulu. And if we, you know, we look at the Southeast region, that's a huge traffic pool and has been very slow to come back. I point you to the Mid-Atlantic and New England, where, you know, roughly 45% of the seats offered in 2019 are being offered today. Think about the sheer amount of traffic in New York, Boston, Washington, et cetera. So you get a sense here that this is a very uneven map as to how capacity comes back. And with an uneven map, it's very difficult to begin to rebuild hubs because hubs need symmetry. And that's not what we see here. This chart does nothing more than take those percentages and put it in numbers. Just to give you an idea, in the Southeast region, that 25% of capacity that hasn't been added back today is equivalent to 209 million passengers. In the Pacific, it's 197 million passengers. In the Mid-Atlantic, it's 178 million passengers. You get a sense of just how much is sitting on the sideline today. And that's very, very important. Just like we saw in the past recession, large hub airports, you know, there are 30 of them, and large hub airports, as defined by the FAA, all of you on this call likely know this, but they enplane more than 1% of the passengers in the United States. So today, less than 49% of the large hub airport traffic in 2020 is negatively impacted. 57% of medium hub traffic is being impacted. 61% of small hub traffic is being impacted, and 64% of non-hub, or the smallest airport traffic, is being impacted. I would suggest to you that if we have this talk in 3 months, that non-hub number is going to be somewhere closer to 75 than it is to 64. So if we think about the airport impacts out there, you know, it's the medium, the small, the non-hub, they're all being impacted in a big way. And I mean, even the large hubs, but a lot of that it can be found in the Northeast and in California. You know, with the CARES Act having ended, we've already seen American Airlines say that they're going to stop flying to 13 small markets. They just announced 3 more yesterday, I believe. This is going to take the shape of what we've seen in past recessions, where unfortunately the smaller airports in the country are going to suffer the greatest. So that's that one. Do I just keep going here, guys?
Is that, there's another one?
Yeah, there's another one.
There's another one.
Do we have time?
We do have time. We have a couple of questions. Maybe
Okay.
we'll field a couple of questions. One was about, I think looking at not just macro forecasts to predict what's going to happen, but looking at really market segments more closely. So the age of travelers, technological sophistication and occupations and whatnot. I mean, we typically look at leisure and business. Do we need to have a finer sort?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Joe. And, it's so early that we know a little. We certainly don't know a lot. And I know my good friend, the chief economist at A4A, John Heimlich, they are going to be doing some work in some surveys. But what we know has been the younger folks that have been traveling. The older population has largely stayed home. That has been kind of a unique trend, that they have provided the lion's share of especially the early travel, where, I'm bulletproof. I don't need a mask. I don't need anything. And I want to go to the beach. So that's kind of where that piece has been thus far. Obviously this weekend, with 50 million people supposedly traveling, it's going to be a mix of all. But we should know more in a little bit as to what those categories are. But, right now we really do need to stay focused on just that simple leisure business mix. And this is very much a leisure demand period like we've never seen. Business demand is 90% less than it was a year ago, as measured, as understood. Quite honestly, if we think about 2019, Apple Computer would put 48 executives in first and business class on a flight between San Francisco and Shanghai every day. That's not going to happen. And those first and business class tickets subsidize an awful lot of domestic service. And that's another reason why you'll see in the next presentation, we're not trying to be negative, but at the same time, very, very cautious that the domestic network is not going to come back rapidly.
All right, maybe we should continue on, press on, Mike.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Bill, with the next one?
Okay. All right. In this one, we take a look at the prospects for demand and airline recovery. And this is based on our work to date. I mean, it certainly is a piece that will evolve as we understand a little bit more about the economy. But if there is a bias to reflect, it is that we are quite concerned about the damage that has been done to the economy, about the number of displaced workers, the disposable income that is associated with displaced workers, and the fact that what disposable income might be there is going to be more focused on food and shelter than an airline trip. If we think about, for all of us, I mean, we're all having to think about things so differently than we have in the past. These waves of new COVID cases are appearing everywhere, whether it's Europe, whether it's Asia, whether it's in the US. We don't have to tell you 47 states are in the CDC red zone right now. And so, the COVID cases and where they are, where they're peaking, has a tremendous effect on airline capacity and how it's deployed and how hubs will be rebuilt. We combined, after a lot of thinking, many people were saying that, history doesn't matter. Well, I don't know that that's the case or not, but the only time we really saw a tremendous demand shock was 9/11. And the recovery from the Great Recession was quite long. And so we just kind of put those together and kind of allowed that to be our guide as we thought about this. Capacity, as Peter mentioned, capacity is being added back into the system, but demand lags. That's going to be the case for some time. Maybe not this weekend, but it certainly is going to be the case in the shoulder season until we get to Christmas and New Year's, and then in January and February. Networks. I mean, if the industry is going to be smaller, then hubs are going to be smaller, right? I mean, it just kind of goes without saying. And if hubs are going to be smaller, connectivity is going to be less. If connectivity is going to be less, there are going to be fewer points connected to that hub. It's a downstream effect, and that's the way it works. And so, that has been a guide for us as well. Been really, everybody talking about early on, is it going to be a letter in the alphabet? Is it going to be a V? Is it going to be a W? Is it going to be a U? Is it going to be an L? Now we're talking about Ks. Either way, I mean, GDP took a tremendous hit in the second quarter. We knew it would take a wonderful bounce in the third quarter. But whether it be us, whether it be the Federal Reserve, whether it be OECD, things are going to grow back slower, and they're going to grow back slower for the reasons that I cited, particularly on the displacement of the workforce. Everybody on this call can be a network planner by going to the CDC website and getting a map. And where it is that the virus has been breaking out is where it is that capacity has been very slow to be added back. And so I think it's just important that, again, like I mentioned, all geographies are not the same, because the recovery is going to be uneven, hub redevelopment is going to be uneven and very different for each carrier. If we think about 9/11 and how traffic recovered, relative to the economy, it was the ultra low cost carriers that grew the fastest. And of course, they were fairly small. So we would have expected them to grow fairly fast. The hybrid carriers, Alaska, Hawaiian, and JetBlue, let's remember that JetBlue, its first year in operation was 2000, and therefore it influences that blue line. Southwest was not a small carrier in 2000, but it certainly grew at the expense of the network carriers, the gray line. As they pulled back capacity, Southwest added capacity, and it was very successful for their operation. And they could do that because they had a labor cost advantage and they had fuel hedges in place. So they had a tremendous ability to price aggressively relative to the network carriers. We look at the Great Recession and how traffic recovered by carrier type. Again, the ULCCs starting to step up growth. Alaska, Hawaiian, JetBlue. Alaska was one who really grew aggressively during this period as Seattle became a hot market. It was adding capacity east of the Mississippi fairly aggressively, and Hawaiian was growing fairly aggressively as it was taking new fleet at the time. Southwest, like the network carriers, actually engaged in capacity discipline during this period. While it grew faster than the network carriers, Southwest was actually very measured in how it deployed capacity through the year 2014. If we look at how it is that the economy grew, with the 9/11 recession, the Great Recession, they grew nicely. The dashed line merely shows the growth rates that we've assumed as we've thought about how traffic will come back. And we'll revisit this chart many, many times, I'm sure. So the pandemic is potentially going to cause airlines to make decisions about operating shorter haul flights. Is the regional system going to be what it was? And I think for Peter and I think back to the Great Recession, and we saw that the smallest airports got hurt the worst in terms of capacity. But that was also a time when, Jacksonville, North Carolina had 9 flights a day to Atlanta, and Delta cut that from 9 to 5, and from 5 to 3 ultimately. The question is going to be, are people now going to get back in their car, or are the airlines even going to operate service on fairly short stage lengths because it's not economic? There aren't that many 50-seat jets relative to what has been there in the past. And so I think our view is that the highway is going to become the first access point to the air transportation grid for many small markets out there. For those carriers out there operating short haul and regional flights, American offers a lot, and most of that can be found at their Dallas and Charlotte hubs. And United and most of Delta's regional flying is in Atlanta and Salt Lake City, as you saw earlier. And United, heavy focus in Washington, Chicago, some in Denver, and some in the West. So the recovery of U.S. international travel. This is where there's a lot of thinking, and it's very, very hard to really get too fine in the analysis at this point, as we have, quarantine periods, as we have borders that are, countries that are not accepting passengers from the U.S. and the like. But just to put it in perspective, taking a look at 2020 international departures as a percent of 2019, only less than a third of capacity between the US and Europe is being operated. Less than 25% of capacity between the US and Asia is being operated. Less than, it's less than 40% overall. Mexico is a big winner because it's a leisure destination, and the Middle East and Africa look like it's very aggressive, but that's because there's very little capacity that is deployed between the U.S. and those continents or areas. And then we see the Caribbean and Central America, again, leisure-oriented destinations that are receiving the most international travel today. If we look at the top 15 carriers ranked by overall international traffic impacted, you would expect it to be United, American, and Delta. And as I mentioned in my earlier comments talking about United, you just see how important the international component is to that carrier in building back. And you can see, even we read stories about British Airways and Lufthansa. These are carriers that are struggling mightily. Norwegian is filed for bankruptcy and likely will be liquidated. The carnage is not complete. So a prolonged traffic and revenue doubt will likely not sustain all of the operations of all the airlines operating today. And Peter mentioned that. It's going to be the virus, the economy, consumer behaviors, and how it is that the carriers redraw their maps. When we began this process and we finished the forecast, our first forecast for 2020 in early April, and our forecast was that domestic traffic would be 40% of 2019. And man, all of us got, that's negative, that's this, that's that. you know, you guys don't get it. It's going to be a V-shaped recovery. Yeah. Our view is that it's not a letter of the alphabet, but rather that the direction of the recovery looks a little bit more like the square root symbol, where we had the bounce down, the hard bounce down in the second quarter, a bounce up in the third quarter, and then very slow from a long tail, a very slow trajectory out through 2028. But if we think about the announcements right after the pandemic, all of the carriers, particularly Delta, was very aggressive at saying, I'm going to park a fleet. I'm going to park this fleet. I'm going to park that fleet. And if you take all of that into account, the traffic generating capacity in 2020 is 8.5% less than it was in 2019. So even if we wanted to fly all of the available capacity that isn't parked, we would only be able to fly 91.5% of 2019 right now. So here is where it is that our initial thought was. We haven't really changed it, other than the fact that we look very bullish at predicting that 40% of 2019 is going to be the number. Right now, the domestic system is basically 36% of 2019. Next year, I could see the number being higher than 55.6, but let's also appreciate that the first 2 months and the first 10 days of March, the industry was roughly 105% of what it was in 2019, and we won't have that in 2021 to count. I want to be very wrong on this number and hope that it comes up. But we also are an overriding assumption here, as Peter talked about, was, yes, we're reading nice press releases on vaccines now. The availability of a vaccine, great. But when does a vaccine vaccinate? And we don't believe that that will be the case until the second half of 2021. Just taking into account the historical relationship of international traffic to domestic, the DPIJ, or domestic passengers on an international journey, you can see it's going to be a very, very slow build back. So this is here more for illustration, but it is based on the industry over the past 10 years and how the two have related to one another. So finally, I think history can be a guide here. We can learn some lessons. It's not going to be perfect by any means, but so many just kind of focused on the pandemic, and I want to focus on a pandemic-induced recession, and that's where that really forms the basis of our work. The interdependencies of the international and domestic, we can't overstate that. And certainly, if American, Delta, and United are going to be smaller, then the remaining 7 carriers are going to have to grow very aggressively for the industry to return to 2019 levels or 2018 levels, however it may be. So with that, I am complete.
Thanks, Bill.
You bet.
Bring on our panelists, shall we? JP and Lance, join us. Thanks. Do you guys want to kick it off with thoughts, comments?
Sure. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion, thought-provoking. Can you say a little bit about new entrants? Are there opportunities for new airlines to come in and steal some of the market share?
Thank you so much for the question, Lance. I'm really, really bullish on the new entrants here. There are 2 that are on the drawing board. One is David Nealman's Breeze, and they are going to initially take E190 aircraft from Azul and begin their operation, and then they will begin to take delivery of the Airbus 220 in 2022. If Neilman thought there was opportunities in 2019, he probably can't get to the dinner table fast enough to start Breeze. Andrew Levy is the other one that's on the drawing board, and his plan is to use 737-800s flying to more leisure destinations. And just to know Andrew's background, he was one of the original founders of Allegiant. And he was the CFO at United. And so he is he's definitely a veteran. He's war torn. And I believe that Andrew is looking at opportunities to build a much better Allegiant, more high quality Allegiant going forward. So those are the two we know of. I believe there will absolutely be room for them. And honestly, I mean, to make room for them, our view, and Peter mentioned it, is there, will all carriers make it? I think the fundamental question that is hard to answer today. I'm less worried about traffic, but will there be sufficient revenue to support those carriers that have built a network that appeals to the business traveler? And again, the first question in the poll today was, where's it going to be? And it's like, to me, the question is, yeah, I think traffic will be okay, but I think revenue is going to stink relative to what it was. And that's what it is. It's going to be necessary.
So Bill and Peter, one of the things in the airline industry is the timing and the phasing of both fleet, retirements, acquisitions, and also cockpit crew, especially for training. And simulator time is an incredibly high, strict constraint on our system. What are the triggers, or what do you foresee to be the leading indicators for that? Because, you might have, if you miss those, you can get messed up in terms of competitors, because you won't have the fleet and you won't have the crew trained or back current again to actually operate. So what do you guys think we should be looking for as indicators of things happening?
Peter, you want me to go? You want to go?
You can, you think about the pilot side. I'll just say a comment about the fleet side. I mean, so on the one hand, you've had some pretty firm retirements announced. Several airlines have retired entire fleet types, and I assume that means that they're gone and will not be in their fleets. Although a wise man named Monty Brewer, former CEO of Air Canada, once said that an old airplane never goes away. So you have to kind of wonder what's going to happen there. But forgetting about the retirements, remember there's a lot of parked airplanes, and the ones that are flying are being terrifically underutilized. And what all I'm saying here is that in some respects, we used to teach, JP, you and I, that in fleet planning, flexibility is like the dream of airline management. Well, at this moment, if you're an airline and you're flying some of your airplanes, but not at a very high utilization rate, you've got others that are parked in short-term storage, you've got others that are parked in long-term storage, that actually is kind of quite a flexible fleet plan. I mean, depending on what it means is, depending how the demand recovers and the network evolves, these airlines do have flexibility to return aircraft they have parked into service. So I think one of the leading indicators there will be schedules and capacity. How fast are airlines around the world taking parked aircraft out of back into service, take them out of parking and back into service.
JP, you asked, I would expect this, but you asked the ultimate question with regard to pilots. And I think one of the reasons why the industry has been pushing so hard for a CARES 2 package is to be able to keep as many pilots at the ready and trained in the event demand bounces and there are opportunities. We need to train everybody but we all know that that's the training. And if, you know, the training bubbles, if we let people go, I mean, it's just the downstream effect is so much. I think one of the things that's been nice is to see, you know, American, Delta, and United be able to negotiate agreements where they've been, you know, there've been a lot of concessions made to keep pilots on the payroll. Whether that was a bet for a CARES 2 package, whatever. I mean, it's good. But you know, a lot of people think that now the pilot shortage is over. The pilot shortage ain't over. We have a lot of pilots that are going to retire over the next 5 years. We're going to be right back to where we were when this system begins to grow back. And so I think it's just very important we remain vigilant on programs that fill that pipeline and keep people trained and at the ready. Yeah, they're available today, but it's kind of I think we can say kind of an artificial comfort.
How about maintainers, Bill?
I'm sorry.
Maintenance, how about, we
I
have,
mean, same thing, Joe. I mean, you know, just as we were struggling with pilots in the beginning in 2013, we really saw, you know, the maintenance technician issue come to the fore in 2015, 2016. So it's the same thing. I mean, it's, you know, now we have a supply, but again, you know, these are not young workforces. And we desperately need to continue to encourage people into those positions because there are going to be jobs available and there is going to be a career. It is just, you know, demand shocks have just got everything in a hold period right here.
So do you see this as an opportunity perhaps for a single pilot cockpit, maybe on some, you know, in certain routes and certain aircraft types?
You know, Lance, I'm going to bring you to the Airline Pilots Association because I know you'd love to have that conversation. And you and I can, and I'm just going to sit there. But no, I mean, look, should there be? Of course. Will there be? No. How's that? Do I think the cargo side will potentially see something different? Yes. I mean, cargo always leads, right? I mean, with this type of thing. So, I mean, I would expect that we may see that. We know we're going to probably see unmanned flying some cargo to rural areas, that kind of thing. No, I'm not bullish on the one person cockpit in the passenger business anytime soon. And I'm probably not around when it does happen.
we have a question about, from the audience about seniority lists and labor mobility in the pilot, in that career field, or any potential changes to how that has been going since the dawn of time, since Orville and Wilbur.
Yeah. You know, for a guy who basically spent the first 25 years of his career negotiating labor agreements, seniority is just one of those things that I'm going to let Lance talk to Alpa about when we talk to him about one-person cockpits, because of course it doesn't matter. But no, I mean, it would be nice if there was a system seniority list and people could move from carrier to carrier, but we don't have that. And I think it's very hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, you know, at this point. I still think it's right, but it's not going to happen.
So going back to, by the way, you know, one of the things in the aircraft manufacturing side is back in the day, good old days in Los Angeles, one company lose a defense contract, the company across the street would get it. and the same person who was working on the project would like cross the street and start working at a new company.
Right.
So it didn't really matter where, and that would be what you'd actually create if you had a system-wide seniority list, that you'd be able to have mobility, and poor management would be penalized and good management would be rewarded.
Sure. You know, JP, I mean, it's just when we see our friends in Seattle talking about laying off the number of people that they're considering at this point, and the fact that they really don't see demand for a decade. You know, I mean, one of the things that you know we talk about is part of our thinking too is that there are really no new aircraft for growth until 2024, because the balance sheets have been so damaged that if I don't have an airplane that's financed right now, I'm probably not going to finance anything. I know Delta's talking to Boeing about some MAXs because you know what? There are going to be some incredible deals out there. But at the same time, those are not going to necessarily be growth airplanes. Delta's needed to do some work on the fleet anyway, and they may be just looking at this as the opportunity to, in effect, do a fleet refurbish without needing court assistance to do so.
Now, earlier on, Peter spoke about the fact that if you have a smaller airline, smaller hub, your CASM is going to go up. Do you have a sense for what is it going to be, a 1%, a 2%, a 5%, a 10%? You know, I'm pulling you guys out on the line. Give me a percent here so that we can look back in a year or two and see.
I'm signing off, JP. This is Peter's question.
Well, yeah, again, yeah, if I had those kind of numbers, I'd be investing in my choice of airlines to see who would do the best. I mean, it's more than 1%. I mean, I can't pull it. You know, I'd have to. That's a good study question to do, and you could probably back into that type of number by looking at data and trying to do some adjustments. But I don't think 5 or 10% is unreasonable, JP.
You know as well as anybody, JP. I mean, it's hard to find big pools of fixed costs that you can easily take out of the system, right? And you know, as I look at the income statement today, the American, Delta, and United spend $20 billion a year buying seats from regional carriers. One of the pools I would immediately look to is to cut back on that $20 billion and reduce my fixed cost as a way to take out. And I think that's another reason why the regional system is just going to struggle here. There's just not going to be the same demand.
And JP, I was just going to add that I had to take those slides out of my presentation, but in a previous version, we already have, not that it's worth anything. In fact, the Form 41 financial data is going to be useless for purposes of teaching and doing normal economic studies through all of 2020, perhaps through all of 2021. For this reason, the CASM of U.S. carriers, or the largest U.S. carriers in second quarter, went from about 15 cents to 37 cents. Right, so it's, you know, those numbers, everything we teach about CASM, about utilization, we might as well throw away the DOT Form 41 data for the next year and a half, I think.
And the interesting thing, as you guys were speaking, is the question of, you know, people's perception of the relative safety in terms of COVID of a small regional aircraft versus a larger one, and maybe driving to Atlanta instead of going on a regional, which then fits into the business model of, I'm going to cut out the cost of buying those seats from a regional carrier. So it'd be interesting for you guys to see if you could take a look at that, because I think this is going to be interesting. You might have 3 different things pulling in the same direction that might.
Well, and one of the questions that I'm sorry, but I'm looking at the chat question from Ralph Nicosia Rusin, which has been up there for a while. And I hope we could actually talk a little bit about it, because I think it's fascinating, and it goes to everything that you've been saying. He's saying that the Aviation Trust Fund invests in airport infrastructure to meet air service needs of communities, including small communities and thin routes. Airlines are trying to develop route systems to optimize profitability. And the question is, from him at least, is post-recovery, do we need public policy to provide corrections to any gaps in the public interest in airline strategies? Can they be market-based, or do we need more regulatory requirements? And that goes back to smaller communities, very short haul routes served by regional jets that are within the drive distance of larger hubs. And that has pretty big policy implications, I think.
Yeah, but this is it's a political question. I mean, there's nothing new there, right?
Well, policy is political, right?
But what a great question. I mean, that is spot on. And I think in 2 years' time, as this settles out and we begin to understand what the industry begins to look like, there is going to be enough pushback on service at small communities and the like. It's going to be a discussion in Washington again. But not until we get through this period. But that was really, really well said and well asked.
So Bill, I thought I heard you say though in your talk that Delta was shifting to the regionals. Was that at the expense of the main line?
I think what it is, all I was saying really is that they have used right now. I mean, Delta didn't file for bankruptcy, so it has contracts with its regional partners, right? And so it has used them to build back its network, and so it would be at the expense of the main line, likely.
And is that about gauge or labor contracts?
Delta is very fortunate in that they probably have the most loose scope clause. And so they have a lot of access to the 76-seat airplane, which is a 2-class airplane, a nice airplane from a consumer point of view. And so they're down to less than 150-seat jets now. So that's a nice airplane to kind of begin to build your way back. It doesn't leave you exposed, and it's sunk money because I'm committed to, X amount paying to my regional partners.
Let me just, there's a question from Matt Blake in the audience. To throw another monkey wrench into the picture, will the drive for greener travel lead to an even slower recovery that never does reach the 2019 levels?
Well, I guess it's easier to talk about it today than it was 4 weeks ago. No, I mean, I don't know how to answer that question. I think the one thing we can say very clearly is that the industry is gravitating to the newer fleets. With newer fleets, there's less carbon emission, less fuel burn, and all those things that come with it. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, I don't know, but I mean, the industry is trying to do its thing. But I would say that if we look at the decisions that are being made by the airlines, it's about flying their newest and most fuel efficient fleets.
And if you look, I mean, it does go back to, this is an unprecedented pause. We've never had this kind of, we had a pause after 9/11 in aviation by a week or whatever. This is a pause that we've never seen before, and hopefully we'll not see again. But the pause in travel, I think, if you do read, there's not been huge studies done, but apart from the impacts on the environment of not having emissions right now and not having aviation at its full level, apart from moving to more efficient fleets, I do think, and it goes back to the question I raised about fundamental changes in air travel behavior, particularly among the demand segments that are concerned about sustainability and green aviation, et cetera. I think in Europe, there already is some evidence, and it could well happen that people will, after this pause, say, well, really, do I need to jump on an airplane and go for a quick weekend instead of taking a train or staying home? I mean, so I think the whole nature of this dramatic interruption, I think, will cause certain segments of demand to rethink their attitude to air travel.
And there are a lot of companies who have, if this pandemic happened 20 years ago, it would have been so much worse. I mean, I look at all the companies who have been able to have people working from home and working remotely and limiting contact. Lots of companies are talking about, well, why don't we get rid of half of our office space and have people hot swap desks? So there will be a change. How long it will last once the changes are made, before people decide that they want to have everybody in their own office and have everybody have their own desk and have meetings, and fly 48 executives to Shanghai. I mean, that's really the question. So that we're going to definitely take a hit on the business side, I think.
Right.
Mike, Kat is indicating that we're out of time.
All right, well, I think it's been a great webinar and very good presentations and nice discussion. And this is actually the last, well, first let me thank Bill and Peter and also JP and Lance. I thought it was very good. And I just want to say this is the last of the NEXTOR webinar. So I thank everyone for attending, and I hope you learned a lot and were enlightened, and hopefully we'll get out of this sooner rather than later. So Joe, you want to say anything?
Yeah, exactly. So thanks everyone. Thanks Bill and Peter, especially. Yeah, hopefully when we do this something next year, it will all be in person.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Have a great day.